We wish we had more time to hear more of your thoughts on this, but thank you very much. That sets the scene for this conversation and for this afternoon. Dr. Ostler, you gave the keynote last night. Now you've been listening to Kathleen Dalton and Nancy Unger and now Kim Porter to give us a few reflections, and you're going to need a microphone. And I'm told you need to speak pretty closely into it and make sure the switch is on. It'll pull right off. There's one for you. I think you're fine.
Okay. One of the issues that I think is raised here as we think about progressivism, the nonpartisan league, and then what Kim Porter has just been saying about the war is what does war do to reform? And this might be, posed as a general question. Certainly, this is a prime example of the importance of that question, because we've had a period in U.S. history where there has been a strong movement for reform. It has lots of different dimensions. The progressive movement isn't just one thing, and we see that when we think about two people who are, clearly progressives. Everybody would recognize that, Roosevelt and La Follette, and yet they had their differences, which were partly about their egos and their different political styles and to some extent their commitments. We see that differences there, but we still have a fairly unified movement that has put a lot of reforms on the table, has achieved a lot, and war is looming. War is looming. And it's always seemed to me that World War I has got to be one of the most tragic things in world history, certainly in the 20th century, and frankly for the United States. Internally, and that's just how I see it. And so the progressive reformers, it's come out a little bit in one way or another here, but to highlight this point, they were very divided about the war, and they were very divided about what it meant for reform. They weren't just divided about it in the sense of would we win, or I don't know, how bad was Germany or something like that. They were divided about, does war help our agenda domestically? And, somebody like Jane Addams said no. War will ruin us. And many others, people that we haven't mentioned, like Randolph Bourne, for example. War will ruin what we're for. It will unleash forces of reaction. Others, though, said, war will help us. It will bring us together. It will increase the possibilities of reform in various ways. And at the outset, people were divided about that, and as the war went on, people became even more divided. So, the answer to me is that war actually really is detrimental to domestic reform. From this case, there'd be lots of other ways to see that, but that's one of the reflections that I have kind of thinking about all of this, yeah.
I would just add, I think you said that very well. I would only add that for somebody like Woodrow Wilson says, well, but World War I, it's the war to end all wars. If we apply true progressive principles and we say, don't be selfish, we have to get out there and uplift, other people, and if we have peace without victory, if we can really have a progressive peace and make this work, this will be the war to end all wars. So for people like Wilson, World War I was sort of a chance to apply progressive principles, globally. It doesn't work, but for him, this was not a violation of progressive principles. It was the culmination of them. It just was a disaster, but he saw it as many progressives did as part of the progressive program.
So let's take some questions, because this is a rare chance for you to get in. Go ahead.
I just have some comments to what you just said, that the war thwarted the progressive movement. I'm not sure exactly the dates, but it wasn't women's suffrage passed right after World War I, and also the progressive income tax during the war, and whether or not you agree with Wilson about the League of Nations. That also came about, which was also, from what I've learned, since the SPL was against war, so that kind of would fit in. So I don't think that war necessarily stopped the progressive movement. Some movement came about, and I know, again, I'm not too sure exactly when the child labor laws were passed, when laws allowed unions, but I think that was pretty much either during World War I or right afterwards.
The suggestion is the progressive agenda continued in spite of the war. Maybe it was slowed down, but things continued to happen here at home.
Well, my sense of the timing of this is that most of the lasting domestic progressive reforms were in place before the war really began, so that the 16th Amendment that created the progressive income tax was passed in 1913. Women's suffrage would be an exception, though, and I'm glad that you brought that up. It does illustrate that in World War I, and I see this even more in World War II, a public argument about the necessity for war to make the world safe for democracy, in this case, gives an opening to people, in this case, advocates of women's suffrage, to say, you know, what about democracy at home, right? And so, you know, you have suffrage advocates making much of that kind of argument and saying, you know, Wilson is keeping us in chains, or there, you know, there's something wrong about this crusade. So I take your point about women's suffrage. On balance, my sense is that most of the major reforms were finished before the war, and that the war, as it progressed, tended to unleash reactionary, repressive tendencies.
It's hard to know which of the war scares in American history did the most damage to the Bill of Rights, but there's the Alien and Sedition Laws of 1798 under the Adams administration. You have the Civil War, the suspension of habeas corpus, and other actions. You have the McCarthy era, but almost all historians agree that the period between 1917 and 1920, the Red Scare, was one of the most severe destructive forces on civil liberties in American history. And Roosevelt, Kim, was right in there. I mean, his virulent denunciations of spies, of sedition, of espionage, of holding up conscription, of saying anything negative about the war effort, put him right square in the center of that reaction.
Yes, I think you're right that one of the problems, and I put that in quotation marks, with examining Roosevelt the progressive, is that as the war comes into play, and not so much the European war, but specifically the American aspect of the war, many of the things that you would have said he never would have said, he never would have done, he turns to those things, you know, calling for punishments for conscientious objectors, punishment, fines, imprisonment for individuals speaking against the war, individuals speaking against the draft, against even the selective service, you know, the volunteerism being spoken against. And he actually picks out a couple of North Dakotans and says, basically, besides A.C. Townley, you know, one of your senators, Isle Grona, is one of the very few, one of 6 U.S. senators to vote against the war. And is that really the kind of guy you want representing you? And he makes a list that he occasionally will revert back to, which includes Fighting Bob as one of the enemies of, well, pretty much the enemy of everything, enemy of motherhood and apple pie. apply. But also Isle Grona, Ernest Lundeen, who was a congressman from Minnesota, and of course Jeanette Rankin just irritated his soul to no end because she voted against the war as well. And so I think you see Roosevelt. I think it's John Morton Blum who's written a fair amount on Roosevelt, who says that when he gets to a certain age, whether it's the health of himself or the war and the impact it has on his children, he almost in some ways stands on his head, that he becomes kind of a grouchy old man even though he's 58, 59.
Well, but just on that speech in Billings, which he gave on October 5th, he says in that speech specifically that people who are not 100% American and foursquare for this war should be locked up during the term of the war and expelled from this country when the war has been won. That's the most extreme statement that he ever made on the subject, and it was made on that anti-NPL tour in October of 1918.
It was allegedly a Liberty Loan tour, but it clearly was not as far as he was concerned. Granted, in some cases, some of the places he spoke at, the Liberty Loan had already been oversubscribed, and so he can make the very brief moment of, yes, buy your bonds, but then he can turn to this anti-German scree, this shadow hunt is the phrase that always comes to mind.
And the two questions here, let's start here. World
War I did end the IWW lobbyists. One thing. She asked about the Labor Act passed in 35.
So labor history is mixed in this period, but
That's the 30s, though. I mean,
Yeah,
if the
long
question
after.
is, what was the impact of World War I, during the war period, that's a New Deal Act. So no, I would agree that in World War I we have really enormously, repressive time, and there, I think the momentum of some progressive goals, continues. But I also wonder, and I hate these what-ifs in history, but it does seem to me that when you get this kind of fire for reform, after a while people get fatigue. And I'm wondering if there hadn't been the war, how much longer that fervor for, you think of like the ferment of the 1960s, and there's, the anti-war and all this stuff, and civil rights and, whatever else. But I think after a while people, the campaign for 1920 was, the return to normalcy. That people do just kind of want to.
We may have had that anyway.
Yeah.
Harding would have,
Right.
Coolidge and Harding maybe
Right.
would have emerged from all of this somehow.
Yeah, so it's really hard to say. I mean, I agree that I think that World War I really puts a screeching halt to most progressive momentum. It doesn't do it entirely, but I'm not sure what would have been the result without World War I. It's hard to say.
go ahead here.
This reminds me.
You first, then you.
Okay, I would like to ask the question, three things, racism, religion, and the suppression of women's rights, how that played into the delay of Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, and Oklahoma getting into the United States during that time period.
So
Could someone address that question, please?
territorial status and race, religion, and the repression of human rights. Who wants to start with that?
Well, I'll say something. I don't know how much it will help. I mean, it's interesting because, there's as you know, a whole wave of states that are created in 1890. And 2 Dakotas are created, and some others, I forget them at the moment. But, this is basically, the Republican Party making states, right? I mean, that's what's happening. But there's a bunch of places that could have become states at the same time that don't, and you give 4 examples: Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Utah. And I think you point to reasons for that. Clearly in Utah, as everybody knows, Utah's not going to become a state until the Mormon Church abandons polygamy, and they finally do that, and then they become a state. In New Mexico, it's really the fact of a Catholic Hispanic significant population. In Arizona, something similar, and in Oklahoma, I think that the issue of large Native American population affects things, but I'm not so sure on Oklahoma.
Anybody else on this? Go ahead, Bernie.
Yeah, I wanted to mention the parallel of our own Senator Nye, the anti-war before World War II. I hear from North Dakota.
Gerald P. Nye, one of the few senators to vote against American entry into World War II, has Senate hearings on munitions industry. It's a very, Kim, will you talk a little bit about that, and maybe you too, Jeffrey. The populous states were pretty onto that idea that the wars are being fought for the benefit of the munitions industry, and that if there were no other reason not to want to go to war, that would be a good one.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, one of the loud voices, of course, during the First World War, at least in North Dakota, Montana, South Dakota, maybe Minnesota, are individuals who are opposed to the war. A.C. Townley being the absolute, the absolute voice that I had a couple of quotes from, and I think if you look at that generation that grew up or at least came to political maturity in the teens, where someone like A.C. Townley is saying, if you're going to send your sons, you should also send the wealth of the Rockefellers, or if you're going to send my son or my neighbor's son or the neighbor's sweetheart, that you should also tax the wealth of these folks who are getting rich on munitions manufacturing. And I think in some ways that puts a bee in the bonnet, for a better word, for the next generation of politicians who, as we are seeing World War II looming, are saying, wait a second, are we going to get dragged into another war based upon munitions, based upon the manufacturers who had wanted a market? And I think someone like Nye in particular, and you could name another half dozen, clearly are hearkening back to their NPL days, or at least the NPL time period, even if they hadn't been members, and they say, well, wait a second, that's exactly what A.C. Townley said. Now, Townley becomes very much a disreputable character. He is charged under the Sedition Act and ends up going to federal prison, but there's still a lot of folks who see him as some type of a folk hero. And if you lost your son, lost your neighbor's son, husband, whatever, I'm certain you want to have somebody to blame. Roosevelt can say, my son was blooded for the nation, but somebody else is going to say there's got to be somebody to blame, and I think it's, the munitions manufacturers.
We're just about out of time here, so we're just going to take one or two more, starting here. Yes.
I was wondering if you could someone could speak to something we talked about last night, which is about why the Progressive Party didn't last, and I was wondering if it was because it was so much just based on the personality of Roosevelt that the whole destiny of the party was all about the man, and once the man was gone or he was no longer running, that it couldn't sustain itself, and that he supported Hughes kind of grudgingly in 1916. When he died in 1919, people were talking about him, that he was going to be the nominee again in 1920. So I was just wondering if you could address, the fate of the Progressive Party as a third party and TR as an individual.
How central was TR to the success and the longevity of the progressive movement? Do you want to touch this? I'll just bring you the microphone.
Well, some of TR's guys show up in the New Deal, so you get Donald Richburg, Harold Ickes. Obviously, progressivism is larger than TR, but he was planning on running in 1920, and he was trying to steal the nonpartisan league issues, talking about farm collectives, and he was still trying to use the 1912 welfare state, old age pension kinds of issues, and take the nonpartisan league issues. He had been friendly, Clay's going to talk about this, TR had been friendly with the nonpartisan league in the beginning. So I think progressivism is bigger than TR, it's bigger than all of these people, and They do get some laws passed in the 20s, and a lot of those progressives educate the next generation. Eleanor Roosevelt's going to Bull Moose meetings, even though her husband's a Woodrow Wilson supporter. So we know that Franklin Roosevelt was very much influenced by Theodore Roosevelt. So I think progressivism takes a nap in the 20s. We get Shepherd Towner and a few maternity, early childhood health laws, and George Norris is continuing to fight. There's certain people who are still trying, but they'll come back, and they are larger. The movement is much larger than the Nonpartisan League and TR.
Don't leave. I just want to ask a follow-up. I mean, there's a difference between the progressive movement and the Progressive Party. They overlap, but there is a distinction. And that Minneapolis Star-Tribune article we started with last night said, well, the progressive movement is continuing, and Barack Obama has clearly put himself squarely in that movement after the Osawatomie speech. So can you just talk a little bit about movement v. party?
Yes. Capital P progressive means the Bull Moose Party of 1912. Small p progressive means people who are, you could see grassroots movements of all different kinds, including, prohibition counts as a progressive movement for a while. Well, temperance, and there are different forms of that. There's an anti-smoking part of progressive movement. And so small p progressives were, all over a million issues. By World War I, some historians talk about Woodrow Wilson and war socialism, because Woodrow Wilson is not a fan of the welfare state. He doesn't go for the Bull Moose kind of platform because he thinks states' rights are more important. But then he becomes president, and then wartime socialism, he takes over the railroads to operate them more efficiently. He gets a little bit of public housing. He sends out his guys to go on an anti-syphilis campaign around the training camps. He won't let people drink. So he's got a lot of progressive. Woodrow Wilson has a lot of kind of random progressive impulses, even though he never signs on to the welfare state. So we have, a lot of different kinds of small p progressives.
Sharon, I know we have to stop. Do you have any announcements to make? Is there anyone who's burning to say any last thing here? Because go ahead, Kim.
Well, I'm not certain I'm burning to say it, but if I give the opportunity, I will. Historians have a great tendency to periodize. That is, we like to put little lines here and there and say, this is the Gilded Age, this is the Progressive Era, those are the lines that are in my world anyway. And I think sometimes we get a little too wed to those to say, yes, the war 1917 brings the end to progressive America, and it does large p, small p, but you do see things moving on, whether it's the temperance movement, whether it's women in voting, Shepherd Towner, or whether that small p kind of goes into abeyance until 1933. So don't always believe those periods that are put out there.
Let me just say this much. I know we're frustrated because we didn't get more time with the three of you and with Kathleen this morning. But for those of you who can come tomorrow to Medora, one of the best moments of the entire week for us is the Medora roundtable discussion at the Chuck Wagon. Everyone's dressed casually. We go out. We're in the Badlands. The formality comes down a little, and it's a chance. It's a more intimate setting. People can ask questions of anyone. I think Kathleen can't stay, unfortunately, but the rest of you will be here. Kim, I don't know if you're going to be able to be there tomorrow. You could come. Why not? It's the Badlands.
It's just Badlands, and I did extend my reservation.
Good. So we'll hope that you're there in the morning. But Sharon, then we'll regroup there and we'll continue this discussion. And
with us.
Sorry,
Kathleen will.
You will be with us tomorrow. Oh, wonderful! You get to stay. So they'll all be out in the Chuck Wagon Cafe, and so wear your handkerchief and come on out.